You know what your problem is. You've never been enough. Not as a husband, not as a provider, not as anything. You deserve nothing, Marcus. Less than nothing. Elaine said it standing in our kitchen at 11 at night, car keys still in her hand from the argument that had started over something so small I genuinely can't remember what it was anymore. A missed bill, a forgotten errand. Something that shouldn't have mattered enough to earn a sentence like that, delivered in a voice flat enough to suggest she'd been holding it in reserve for longer than one bad evening. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say to a sentence built that precisely to leave no room for rebuttal. I went to the guest room, and she went to bed, and neither of us said another word to each other that night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Elaine screaming in the driveway. Her car, a silver sedan she'd owned for 6 years, sat in a smoking, blackened ruin where it had been parked the night before, the windshield shattered outward from the heat. The paint bubbled and peeled along the hood in long, ugly streaks. A neighbor was already outside with a phone pressed to his ear, calling it in. Elaine stood barefoot on the driveway in her robe, one hand pressed over her mouth, staring at what used to be her car like she couldn't fully process what her own eyes were showing her. My name is Marcus Reyes. I'm 67 years old. I've been married to Elaine for 11 years, and until that morning, I believed the worst thing that could happen to our marriage was a bad argument that neither of us knew how to walk back from. I didn't know yet that the fire in our driveway had nothing to do with our marriage at all, and that finding that out would end up testing us harder than the fight ever had. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, right when you were already at your lowest, hit subscribe and drop a like before we go on. You're not going to want to miss where this story goes. I should explain the argument and the year that led up to it before I explain the fire. Elaine and I met in our mid-50s at a mutual friend's retirement party, both of us having come out the other side of first marriages that had run their course years earlier. Mine ended by a quiet divorce, hers by widowhood after her first husband passed young. I was easing out of a long career at a mid-sized logistics company, and she was still consulting part-time in urban planning, and neither of us walked into that party expecting to find anything except decent conversation and a second helping of dessert. She had a directness about her even then that I mistook, in those early months, for confidence rather than what it sometimes actually was, a low tolerance for anything that didn't move at the pace she expected. I loved her for the directness anyway. I still do, most days, even now, even after everything. We married 2 years after that party, in a small ceremony her parents mostly paid for, since my own budget in those years didn't stretch much past rent and student loans. I remember standing at the front of that room thinking I'd never met anyone who made ordinary life feel less like a series of obligations, and more like a project worth building carefully. The first several years were good in the plain, unremarkable way marriages are good before real hardship tests them. Steady jobs, a starter house we fixed up ourselves on weekends, a rhythm neither of us questioned because there wasn't yet any reason to. The cracks started small, the way they usually do. Elaine's father passed away in our 6th year of marriage, sudden and unexpected, a heart attack in his sleep that left her mother alone in a house too large for one person, 4 hours away in the town where Elaine had grown up. Elaine took the loss hard, harder than either of us fully accounted for at the time, and something in her hardened afterward in a way I didn't know how to reach. She started keeping score in small, quiet ways she probably didn't even recognize as scorekeeping. Who'd remembered which errand, who'd shown up for which obligation, who'd let which small promise slip. I don't think it was malicious. I think grief simply narrowed the margin she had left for anyone else's imperfections, mine included. The last 2 years had been hard on us in the ordinary, grinding way that marriages get hard, not one catastrophic betrayal, just a slow accumulation of smaller ones. I'd been passed over for promotion I'd been counting on, which put a dent in the household budget we'd built our 5-year plan around. Elaine's mother had gotten sick, which pulled Elaine into 6-hour round trips most weekends to help with care, exhausting her in ways that left very little patience left over for me by the time she got home. We'd stopped, somewhere in there, having the kind of conversations that keep a marriage from calcifying into two people quietly performing partnership instead of actually practicing it. I want to be honest, because this story doesn't work if I paint myself as blameless. I withdrew during that stretch, the way men sometimes do when they don't know how to fix something and would rather disappear into work than admit that. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. I forgot the bill that started the argument that night, and it wasn't the first bill I'd forgotten that year, which meant Elaine's anger, however brutally it was phrased, wasn't entirely without a cause I'd helped create. But there's a difference between earning criticism and earning that sentence. You deserve nothing, less than nothing. I turned that phrase over in my head 100 times in the weeks since, trying to locate the version of me that had actually earned it, and I never quite found him. I found a tired, distracted, imperfect husband. I never found a man who deserved to be told flatly that he was worth less than nothing to the person who'd promised to spend her life with him. The fire department and the police arrived within 20 minutes of the neighbor's call. I stood in the driveway in sweatpants, watching two firefighters confirm what was already obvious: the fire had burned itself out overnight, contained entirely to the vehicle, no damage to the house, no injuries, while a police officer named Detective Alvarez walked the perimeter of the car with a flashlight, even though it was full daylight, examining the scorch pattern with the particular unhurried attention of someone who does this for a living and has learned not to rush a scene. "We'll need to ask you both some questions," she said, once the firefighters had cleared out. "Separately, if that's all right." I didn't think much of the separately at the time. I understand it now for what it was: standard procedure. The kind investigators use whenever a fire happens to a couple's shared property immediately after a documented, audible argument the night before. Because the neighbor who'd called it in had also, apparently, heard raised voices through his open window around 11 the previous night, and had mentioned it, unprompted, to the first officer on scene. Detective Alvarez sat with me at our kitchen table, the same table where Elaine had said those 5 words less than 12 hours earlier, and asked me, with careful neutrality, to walk her through the previous evening. "We had an argument," I told her, because there wasn't any version of honesty that let me leave that part out, and lying to a fire investigator about the exact night her car burned struck me as the single worst decision available to me. About a missed bill. She said some things. I slept in the guest room. What things did she say? I hesitated, not because I wanted to protect Elaine from an unflattering quote, but because saying it out loud to a stranger with a notepad felt like a second, smaller humiliation stacked on top of the first one. "She told me I deserved nothing," I said, "that I was worth less than nothing to her." Detective Alvarez wrote that down without visible reaction, the particular blankness of someone trained not to let their face do anything a defense attorney could later characterize as bias. "And where were you between midnight and 6 a.m.? "In the guest room. Asleep, as far as I know. Can anyone confirm that?" "No," I said, and heard, even as I said it, exactly how bad that single word sounded stacked on top of everything else: a fresh, ugly fight. A public humiliation delivered by his own wife. No alibi, and a car burned to a shell 8 hours later in his own driveway. "I understand how this looks," I told her. "I didn't do this, but I understand how it looks." "We follow the evidence, Mr. Reyes," she said, not unkindly. "Right now, the evidence is a fight. That's not an accusation. It's just where we start." I want to describe what the next several days felt like, because I think it's the part of this story people understand the least until it happens to them. Being investigated, even briefly, even for something you know with total certainty you didn't do, changes the texture of your own house. I found myself cataloging my own behavior the way a suspect does, wondering which ordinary gesture, sitting quietly at the table, avoiding eye contact out of simple exhaustion rather than guilt, might read as evidence to someone looking for a reason to believe the worst. My brother, Danny, drove up from 2 states away the second day, after I called him mostly just to hear a voice that wasn't a detective's or Elaine's carefully neutral one. "You need a lawyer," Danny said, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table Elaine and I had fought at 4 nights earlier, now somehow the sight of an entirely different kind of dread. "Not because you're guilty, because innocent people get the timeline wrong under pressure more often than guilty ones do, and you don't want your nerves mistaken for something they are not." I hired an attorney the next morning, a measured, unhurried man named Philip Osai who'd handled a handful of cases like this before and seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that his newest client was, for the moment, the leading person of interest in an active arson investigation. "Don't change your routine," he told me. "Don't avoid the detective's calls. Don't get defensive when they ask the same question 3 different ways, because that's not them trying to trip you up out of malice. That's just how interviews work when investigators are trying to see if a story holds steady under repetition. The innocent version of you and the guilty version of you say almost the same words. The difference shows up in the details, and you have real details because you have a real, boring, honest account of where you were." His calm helped more than I expected it to. There's a particular vertigo that comes from being suspected of something monstrous by people who are, for the most part, simply doing their jobs competently, and without malice, a vertigo made worse by knowing that any visible frustration on my part could easily read, to an outside observer, as the frustration of someone caught rather than someone wrongly accused. My sister, Rosa, called on the 3rd day, having heard about the fire from a cousin before I'd had the chance to explain the situation myself, and her first question, asked gently, but asked nonetheless, was whether I needed her to drive over. "I'm not under arrest, Rosa," I told her. "I'm just a person the police are talking to because it's the logical place to start." "I know you didn't do this," she said, "but I also know how these things go sometimes. I know what you're capable of and what you're not." "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than I think she fully understood, because in those first several days, having even one person state their certainty plainly, without hedging, felt like the only solid ground available to stand on. Elaine, for her part, didn't accuse me outright. But she didn't defend me either, not in those first few days, and the absence of a defense felt almost louder than an accusation would have. She moved through the house with a kind of careful, watchful distance, the distance of someone relitigating, silently, every unflattering thing she'd ever believed about the man she'd married. "Did you do it?" she finally asked me, 4 days after the fire, standing in the kitchen in almost the exact spot she'd stood in the night of the argument. I didn't get angry. I understood by then why the question existed, even if it landed like a blow. "No," I said. "I know you have every reason, after what you said to me that night, to wonder whether I'd want to hurt you back. But burning your car wouldn't have hurt you. It would have hurt us. Both of us. I don't know how to make a marriage work with somebody by destroying the things that keep them functioning day to day. Whatever else is wrong between us, I never once wanted that." She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face the way you search a stranger's for tells, and something in her expression finally cracked, just slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the things I said that night. I've been sorry since about 10 minutes after I said them. I just didn't know how to walk it back before all of this happened, and now it feels like walking it back would look like I'm trying to protect you from suspicion instead of actually meaning it." "Mean it anyway," I said. "Even if the timing's bad, especially because the timing's bad." The insurance adjuster came out the following week, a brisk, unbothered woman named Carol who'd clearly seen far worse than a single burned sedan, and moved through her assessment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned not to let other people's tragedies slow down her own paperwork. She photographed the wreckage from a dozen angles, asked Elaine a series of routine questions about the vehicle's condition prior to the incident, and mentioned, almost in passing, that the claim would likely move faster once the police report was finalized, since arson claims required a different processing track than accidental fires. "It helps that you two aren't the ones under suspicion anymore," she said, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, how strange it was to hear our own recent status as suspects referenced so casually by a stranger holding a clipboard. "Arson claims where the homeowners implicated can take months to resolve. Yours should move a lot faster now that there's an outside party identified." Elaine didn't say anything until Carol had driven away, standing in the driveway staring at the scorched outline where her car had sat. "It's strange," she said, "hearing someone talk about whether we were suspects like it's just a line item on a form. Like the worst week of our marriage is just a processing delay to somebody else." "That's probably a mercy in its own way," I said. "Imagine if everyone who touched this case carried the same weight we did. Nobody would get—" She managed a small, tired laugh at that, the first genuine one I'd heard from her since the night of the fire, and something in my chest loosened slightly at the sound of it, small as it was. The break in the case came 9 days after the fire, from a source neither of us expected: a doorbell camera 2 houses down, angled just widely enough to catch a sliver of our driveway in its frame. Footage the owner hadn't thought to check until Detective Alvarez went door to door a second time, expanding the radius of her canvas after the initial round had turned up nothing useful. The footage showed a figure approaching our driveway on foot just after 1 in the morning, moving with the unhurried, confident gait of someone who either lived nearby or had been there before, carrying something in one hand that the resolution was too poor to identify with certainty. The figure spent less than 90 seconds near Elaine's car before walking calmly back the way he'd come. It wasn't enough, on its own, to identify anyone. But it was enough to shift the entire direction of the investigation, because it proved definitively that whoever had done this had come from outside the house, on foot, at an hour when I was, as I'd told them from the start, asleep inside it. "We're widening the investigation," Detective Alvarez told us both, sitting once again at our kitchen table, though this time with a noticeably different tone than her first visit. "I want to ask you something, Mrs. Reyes. Has anyone been paying you unusual attention lately? Online, in person, anywhere? Old friends reconnecting unexpectedly, messages that felt like more than they should have?" Elaine's face did something complicated, a flicker of recognition crossing it before she visibly tried to talk herself out of whatever thought had surfaced. "There's someone," she said slowly. "A guy from my high school, Trevor Kessler. We reconnected on social media about 8 months ago after I posted something about my mom's illness. He started commenting a lot, messaging. I didn't think much of it at first. A lot of people reach out when they see something like that. But it kept going, even after the initial post stopped. He started asking a lot of questions about my marriage, whether I was happy, whether Marcus appreciated me the way I deserved." I sat very still, listening to my wife describe in real time the outline of something I'd apparently been too distracted, too withdrawn, too focused on my own frustrations to notice happening under the same roof I'd been sleeping in. "Did you ever meet him in person?" Detective Alvarez asked. "Once," Elaine said. "A few months ago. Coffee, nothing more, an old friend's catch-up, I told myself. He seemed intense, in a way I didn't fully register as a problem at the time. He remembered things from high school I hadn't thought about in 50 years. Little details. It felt flattering, honestly, in a stupid way I'm not proud of. Someone paying that much attention, right when I felt like the person in this house had stopped paying any at all. I felt that sentence land the way you feel a bruise pressed on directly. I didn't say anything. This wasn't the moment for my own hurt feelings to take up space in the room. Did he ever say anything that concerned? The detective asked. Elaine hesitated. A few weeks ago I mentioned we'd had a fight. Nothing specific, just venting the way you do. He got weirdly upset on my behalf. Said I deserved better than a man who couldn't see what he had. I brushed it off. I didn't think it meant anything. Detective Alvarez asked Elaine to pull up the message history that evening, and together we sat at the kitchen table scrolling back through 8 months of conversation that Elaine had, until that afternoon, filed away in her mind as harmless nostalgia. Reading it in sequence, all at once, rather than one message at a time spread across months, made the pattern impossible to miss in a way it apparently hadn't been in the moment. There were the early messages, ordinary enough shared memories of a high school teacher, a joke about a mutual friend's terrible prom date, the kind of low-stakes reconnection anyone might have with an old classmate online. But threaded through them, with increasing frequency as the months went on, were comments that read entirely differently once you already knew where they were heading. You always deserved more attention than you got in high school. I noticed things nobody else did. I think about what it would have been like if I'd said something back then. You shouldn't have to explain yourself to someone who doesn't see what's right in front of him. I told myself I was just being friendly back, Elaine said quietly, staring at the screen. I didn't think I was encouraging anything. I just thought I was being polite to somebody who used to be a nice, awkward kid nobody paid much attention to. You weren't wrong to be kind, Detective Alvarez said. People like this don't need much material to build an entire narrative around. Sometimes ordinary courtesy is more than enough. A few days later, a second piece of evidence surfaced. This one from an unexpected source, our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Acaffer, who lived 2 houses down and kept unusually late hours due to insomnia she'd complained about at every block party for the past decade. She flagged down a patrol officer canvassing the street a second time and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd noticed an unfamiliar car parked at the end of the block on 3 separate nights in the 2 weeks before the fire, always gone by morning, always positioned with a clear line of sight to our driveway. I didn't think anything of it at the time, she told Detective Alvarez, and later repeated to us directly, clearly shaken to learn what her sleepless nights had inadvertently witnessed. People park on this street all the time. I only remembered it because the car was the same each time and because whoever was in it never got out, just sat there. I should have said something sooner. You said something, Elaine told her gently when Mrs. Acaffer apologized again on our porch a week later, bringing a casserole she clearly didn't need to bring. That's more than most people would have bothered to notice at all. Before we get into what happened when the police finally tracked Trevor down, if this story has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed and tap that like button. It really helps this channel grow. Now, back to the story. It took the department another 5 days to build enough for an arrest warrant. 5 days during which Elaine grew visibly more shaken by the hour, revisiting every message, every comment, every small compliment she'd once read as ordinary friendliness, and now read as evidence of something she'd let get closer to our lives than she'd realized. I keep thinking about what I said to you that night, she told me one evening, sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees the way she used to sit as a much younger woman, before either of us had accumulated the particular exhaustion marriage sometimes brings. You deserve nothing. I said that to the person who's actually been here, actually stayed, actually never once made me feel unsafe in my own house in this whole time. There was a man telling me I deserved better who turned out to be capable of this. You didn't know, I said. None of this is because of what you said to me. Whatever he did because of something broken in him, not because of a sentence you said in anger. I know that logically, she said. I still can't stop feeling it, though. Feeling like my own anger somehow opened a door I didn't know was standing there. It didn't, I said. You can be sorry for the words without carrying the weight of his crime, too. Those are two separate things, Elaine. Don't let him get to keep both. She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, and reached over to take my hand, the first time she'd done that since the night of the argument. "How are you this steady?" she said. "After everything, including 9 days where you were the primary suspect in your own marriage." "Because falling apart wouldn't have helped either of us find the truth faster," I said. "And because somewhere in the middle of being wrongly suspected, I decided I'd rather be the version of myself that handles a crisis with some dignity than the version who lets it turn him into someone he doesn't recognize. My father used to say that character isn't what you do when things are easy. It's what you do when everyone around you would understand if you fell apart, and you choose not to." Trevor Kessler was arrested on a Thursday morning, at his apartment across town, after cell phone location data placed him within a 2-block radius of our house at the exact hour. The doorbell camera had captured the figure approaching Elaine's car. Combined with search history on his own devices, later entered into evidence showing repeated late-night searches about our street, our house, and Elaine's daily schedule, going back nearly 2 months before the fire. Elaine learned the details of his life only in fragments over the following weeks, pieced together from what the detectives were willing to share, and what eventually came out during the trial preparation. Trevor had never married, worked an unremarkable job in insurance claims processing until his own retirement a few years earlier, and lived alone in an apartment 2 towns over that neighbors would later describe, in the brief flurry of local news coverage, as unremarkable in every visible way. He'd apparently harbored feelings for Elaine since high school, feelings he'd never once acted on or even voiced at the time, and had spent the better part of 5 decades constructing, in his own private accounting, a version of their relationship that had never actually existed outside his own head. "That's the part that unsettles me most," Elaine told me, the week the background details started coming in. 50 years. He carried this for 50 years, and I had no idea any of it existed until it burned in our driveway. How do you carry something that long without a single person around you noticing? People who fixate like that get very good at hiding it, I said. It's not something they usually announce, because announcing it risks the fantasy colliding with reality too early. He needed you to stay unaware for as long as possible. That's not affection, whatever he told himself it was. That's control dressed up in a softer word. Detective Alvarez called us both in to walk us through what they'd found, once the arrest was confirmed and the immediate danger, if there had ever truly been an ongoing one, was contained. "He's admitted to it," she told us, sitting across from us in a small conference room at the precinct, more relaxed now than she'd been at our kitchen table weeks earlier. "Says he did it the night after Mrs. Reyes told him about the argument. Says he wanted to, in his words, show her what real devotion looked like by damaging the thing he believed was a symbol of a marriage he thought was making her unhappy. He thought burning my car would make me leave Marcus," Elaine said, flat with disbelief. That's not devotion. That's not even close to what that word means." "People who fixate like this," Detective Alvarez said, "often build an entire private narrative where their obsession gets reframed as love, and any evidence contradicting that narrative just gets filtered out. He wasn't thinking about you as a person with your own judgment, Mrs. Reyes. He was thinking about you as a problem he decided he was uniquely positioned to solve. What happens to him now? I asked. Arson, stalking, unlawful surveillance charges at minimum. Given the pattern of tracking, prosecutors are likely to push for the maximum available. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was planned over weeks, which tends to matter significantly at sentencing. Elaine sat very still for a long moment after that, processing something I could see moving behind her expression before she finally spoke. "I need to say something to both of you," she said. "Not because either of you are owed it exactly the same way, but because I think I need to say it out loud regardless. I spent 9 days quietly wondering, somewhere underneath all my rational understanding of the evidence, whether my own husband might have done this. I let a stranger's obsessive attention feel like validation, right when I should have been paying closer attention to the actual person still choosing to stay in a hard marriage with me every single day. I got that backwards in a way I'm going to be sitting with for a long time. You didn't do anything wrong by not immediately suspecting a man who'd never given you a reason to," I said. "Obsession like that doesn't usually announce itself honestly. That's not a failure of judgment on your part. That's just how these people operate." Elaine's mother drove up the following weekend. The first time she'd made the 4-hour trip in the other direction since her husband's death had reversed the usual flow of visits between them. She arrived with a suitcase she clearly intended to use for longer than a single overnight, and spent 3 days quietly cooking, cleaning, and sitting with Elaine on the porch in the evenings, while I gave them the space I sensed they needed. "I keep thinking about your father," I overheard her tell Elaine one evening, through the screen door I hadn't meant to be listening near. "How he used to say the measure of a marriage isn't whether hard things happen to it. Hard things happen to every marriage eventually. The measure is whether the two people inside it turn toward each other when it happens, or away. It sounds like you two turn toward each other, even with everything stacked against that instinct. That's not nothing, sweetheart. Your father would have been proud of how you both handled this." Elaine cried at that, the good kind of crying, and later told me she'd needed to hear it from someone who'd actually witnessed a full marriage completed, start to finish, rather than from a counselor who only knew our marriage in its current, unfinished middle. "My mother doesn't hand out reassurance easily," she said. "If she says we turn toward each other, I believe her more than I'd believe almost anyone else who might have said the same thing." The weeks that followed the arrest were harder, in some ways, than the investigation itself had been, because there was no longer an external mystery to occupy the space where our own unresolved argument still sat, waiting for us to finally deal with it directly rather than around it. We started seeing a marriage counselor, a quiet, unhurried woman named Dr. Patel who didn't rush either of us toward forgiveness before we'd fully named what needed forgiving in the first place. Elaine and I sat in her office and finally had the conversation the missed bill had only ever been a proxy for about my withdrawal during the hardest stretch of the last 2 years, about her exhaustion curdling into a cruelty she genuinely hadn't meant to let out that far, about how easily two tired, hurt people can build a small but real distance between them without either one fully noticing, until a stranger tries to walk directly into the gap. Dr. Patel had a particular way of asking questions that didn't let either of us hide behind the easier, more comfortable version of the story we'd each been telling ourselves. "Marcus," she said in our second session, "you've described your withdrawal as reacting to feeling like you were failing. I want to push on that a little. Failing at what, specifically?" I sat with the question longer than I expected to need. "At being the kind of husband who could fix things," I finally said. When Elaine's father died, and her mother needed her every weekend, and the promotion fell through, and the bills got tighter, I felt like all of it was somehow a referendum on whether I was providing enough. And instead of talking to Elaine about that fear, I just worked longer hours, like putting in more time at the office was somehow going to solve a problem that had nothing to do with my job at all. And Elaine, Dr. Patel said, turning to her, when Marcus withdrew like that, what story did you tell yourself about why? That he didn't care anymore, Elaine said, quiet. Not that he was scared, not that he felt like he was failing, just that the caring had run out the way I'd seen it run out in my own parents' marriage toward the end before Dad died. I spent 2 years bracing for an ending that was never actually coming, and that bracing turned into resentment, and the resentment turned into that sentence in the kitchen. Two people, both scared, Dr. Patel said, both interpreting the other's fear as indifference, both too proud or too tired to just say plainly what was actually happening underneath the withdrawal and the resentment. That's an extremely common pattern. It's also an entirely fixable one, if you're both willing to keep doing what you just did in this room. We kept doing it, session after session, through the spring and into the early summer, long after the immediate crisis of the investigation had resolved into something we could finally set down and examine without the added pressure of not knowing whether I might still be arrested for something I hadn't done. Some sessions were easier than others. There was one, about 6 weeks in, where Elaine broke down completely, admitting that some small, shameful part of her had felt a strange kind of relief during the investigation, not because she wanted me to be guilty, but because being the wronged party, even briefly, even by mistake, had felt simpler than sitting with her own role in how far we'd drifted. I don't like admitting that, she said, wiping her eyes. It makes me sound like I wanted you to be the villain so I wouldn't have to look at myself. I don't think that's what it was, Dr. Patel said gently. I think when a marriage has been quietly hurting for a long time, sometimes a crisis, even a terrifying one, feels almost like relief, because at least the pain finally has a name and a shape you can point to. That's not the same as wanting your husband to be guilty. It's wanting the ambiguity to end, one way or another. Elaine nodded slowly and reached for my hand across the small space between our chairs. I'm glad it ended the way it did, she said. I need you to know that. Whatever confused relief I felt for a few days, it was never actually about wanting you to be the one who hurt me. I know, I said. I think some part of me understood that even during the worst of it, it didn't make those 9 days easier, but I never once believed you actually wanted it to be true. Patel let the silence sit for a while after that, the particular productive silence of two people, finally hearing each other clearly for the first time in longer than either wanted to admit. Trevor's trial took place 7 months later, and though Elaine had originally planned to stay away from the courthouse entirely, she changed her mind 2 weeks before jury selection began, telling me one evening that she decided avoiding the process felt less like protecting her peace and more like letting him remain, one final time, the person who got to dictate how she engaged with her own life. I want to look at him once, she said, not because I need closure, because I need to prove to myself that I can sit in a room with him and feel nothing but clarity. I think if I skip it, some part of me stays scared of a version of that afternoon I never actually witnessed. I sat beside her in the gallery on the day she testified, watching her walk to the stand in a plain gray blazer she'd chosen deliberately. She told me later, because she didn't want to give the defense attorney any opening to suggest she'd dressed for sympathy rather than. She described the pattern of messages in a level, unhurried voice, the coffee meeting, the specific comment he'd made about deserving better right before the fire, never once raising her voice, never once looking toward the defense table where Trevor sat with his hands folded, staring at the surface of the table rather than at her. The prosecutor walked her through the message history entered into evidence, month by month, and Elaine answered each question plainly, without embellishment, letting the pattern speak for itself the same way it had spoken for itself the night we'd first scrolled back through it together at our kitchen table. Mrs. Reyes. the defense attorney said, during a brief and largely unsuccessful cross-examination. Isn't it true that you engaged warmly with the defendant over these 8 months? That you responded to his messages, met him for coffee, never once told him to stop? I responded the way you respond to an old classmate being friendly, Elaine said, steady. I didn't know I was responding to someone building a private narrative about rescuing me from my own marriage. Being polite to someone isn't consent to whatever they decide that politeness means. The defense attorney didn't have much of a follow-up to that. He sat down a moment later, and the prosecution rested shortly afterward. Combined with the digital evidence, the doorbell footage, Mrs. Ackhaffer's testimony about the parked car, and his own confession given in the initial interview, the case moved quickly toward conviction on all counts: arson, stalking, and unlawful surveillance. He received a sentence that included several years in prison, along with a permanent restraining order barring any contact with Elaine for the remainder of both their lives. Elaine cried in the hallway outside the courtroom after the verdict was read. Not the frightened, unraveling tears of the weeks right after the fire, but something quieter and more releasing. The particular crying of a person finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying without fully realizing how heavy it had gotten. I looked at him, she said once she'd steadied herself. Right when the verdict was read, I wanted to see if there was anything left in me that was still scared of him or still confused about what any of this meant about me. There wasn't. There was just a sad, small man who convinced himself that obsession was the same thing as love and got to find out very publicly how wrong that was. Elaine didn't attend the sentencing. She told me, the morning of, that she decided giving him one more day of her attention, even in a courtroom, even to watch consequences land, felt like more than his obsession deserved. I want the rest of my life to be about us, she said. Not about the version of me he decided to build in his head. I already gave him too much room there for too long without even realizing it. We sat that afternoon on the same porch steps where she'd first started to unravel the guilt she'd been carrying, and she leaned her head against my shoulder in a way that felt, for the first time in longer than either of us could probably name accurately, entirely uncomplicated. I still think about that sentence sometimes, she admitted. You deserve nothing. I know we've talked it through in Dr. Patel's office a dozen times. I know you've forgiven me. I'm still not sure I've fully forgiven myself for meaning it, even for the 10 minutes I meant it. Then let me tell you something plainly, I said. The way you told me that night, except true this time instead of cruel. You were wrong. Not because I'm perfect or because I didn't earn some real criticism during a hard stretch of our marriage. You were wrong because no 10 minutes of anger gets to define 11 years of a person showing up, staying, trying, failing sometimes, and trying again anyway. That's not nothing, Elaine. It never was. She didn't answer right away. She just held on a little tighter, and for a long while neither of us needed to say anything else. I've thought a great deal in the time since about how close that sentence came to becoming the epitaph of our marriage, rather than a single bad night inside a much longer, better story. If Trevor had never been caught, if the doorbell camera had pointed a few degrees the wrong way, if Mrs. Ackhaffer's insomnia had let up during those 2 crucial weeks, I don't know how long the shadow of suspicion might have lingered over us. How long, you deserve nothing, might have sat unaddressed underneath everything else we tried to rebuild. Some marriages don't survive that kind of unresolved doubt. I think about that possibility more than I let myself admit out loud, usually late at night, when Elaine's already asleep, and the house is quiet enough to hear my own thoughts too. What I keep landing on is this. The crisis didn't create the honesty that eventually saved us. It just made the honesty urgent enough that neither of us could keep postponing it any longer. We'd been capable of that conversation for 2 years before the fire ever happened. We simply hadn't been forced to have it yet, and I don't think either of us should have needed to be forced. That's the part I hope stays with me longest, longer than the fear of those 9 days, longer than the relief of the verdict, the reminder that the hard, necessary conversations shouldn't require a crisis to finally get said out loud. A year after the fire, we replaced Elaine's car, a small, practical thing, nothing special, except that she insisted on choosing the color herself this time, something bright and slightly impractical. A shade of blue she said she'd always wanted but never let herself pick because it felt frivolous. "Life's too short for sensible cars," she said, signing the paperwork at the dealership. And I laughed for what felt like the first time in months in a way that didn't have any grief or fear folded into it. We still see Dr. Patel once a month, not because the marriage is in crisis anymore, but because we both decided, somewhere in the aftermath of everything, that a marriage worth protecting deserves the same ongoing maintenance we used to think only cars and houses required. Elaine calls it preventive care. I think of it more simply, as making sure neither of us ever again lets 2 years of quiet distance calcify into a sentence either of us can't take back. The scorched patch of driveway, where her old car once burned, took almost a full year to fully fade from view. A faint gray shadow in the concrete that neither of us ever got around to having professionally cleaned, though we talked about it more than once. I think, if I'm honest, we both left it there a little longer than strictly necessary, not as a wound we wanted to keep reopening, but as a quiet, physical reminder of exactly how close we came to letting an outside obsession finish what our own unresolved distance had already started. We finally had it resurfaced last spring. Elaine stood in the driveway while the contractor worked, watching the last visible trace of that night disappear under fresh concrete, and reached for my hand the way she had on the porch steps months earlier. "Clean slate," she said. "Clean slate," I agreed, and meant it in a way I don't think either of us could have honestly meant it the year before. We also, somewhere in that same stretch of rebuilding, finally made time for something we'd kept postponing through the 2 harder years before the fire, reconnecting properly with my son, Adam, from my first marriage, who lived 3 hours away and had drifted into the kind of polite, infrequent contact that happens when nobody makes the effort to interrupt it. Adam and his wife had a baby girl that same spring, and Elaine and I drove out for the birth together, staying a full week to help however we could, the two of us taking turns walking the hallway with our new granddaughter, Sophia, at 2 in the morning while her exhausted parents finally slept. I don't think I appreciated before all of this happened how much I wanted to actually be present for a milestone like this. I told Elaine, rocking Sophia gently in the guest room of Adam's house, instead of hearing about it secondhand the way I heard about most of Adam's 20s, back when work always seemed to matter more than showing up. "You're here now," Elaine said, watching from the doorway. "That's what actually counts, not the years you weren't, Mrs. Acaffer still brings a casserole every few months, unprompted, an ongoing habit she started the week after the fire and never quite let herself stop. And she was among the first people we told once we got home from Adams, showing up on our porch with a container of something warm before we'd even finished unpacking the car. "You watched out for us before we even knew we needed watching out for," Elaine told her, scrolling through phone photos of Sophia from the hospital. "And you're still doing it. I don't know how people ever properly thank a neighbor like that." "You don't thank it," Mrs. Acaffer said, waving a hand the way she always did when anyone tried to make more of her kindness than she was comfortable acknowledging. "You just pass it along to somebody else eventually, when it's your turn to be the one paying attention." Elaine and I talk sometimes about what might have happened if the doorbell camera 2 houses down had been angled a few degrees differently, Or if Mrs. Acaffer's insomnia had let up during those particular 2 weeks instead of keeping her awake enough to notice a parked car, she had no obligation to remember. It's not a comfortable thought, and we don't dwell on it long when it's, but it does keep both of us, I think, from ever taking the ordinary safety of an ordinary evening entirely for granted, again the safety of an argument that stays just an argument, of a driveway that stays just a driveway, of a marriage allowed to heal at its own unhurried pace rather than being permanently defined by its worst single night. Sophia is 8 months old now, and we drive out to see her every few weeks, staying the weekend whenever Adam and his wife. Some evenings, rocking her to sleep in their guest room, I think about the sentence that started all of this: "You deserve nothing," and how strange it is that a handful of cruel, exhausted words, said by someone who didn't fully mean them, ended up being the thing that forced two people, well past the point most couples stop expecting to change, to finally build a marriage worth actually deserving something in return for. If this story hit home for you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more real stories like ours. And let us know in the comments, have you ever been wrongly suspected of something, right when you were already at your lowest?